Coming up in this video, I'll show you how I paint Grashrak's despoilers from Warhammer Underworld's Beastgrave in a Diablo style. Welcome to Mini Junk, everyone. My name is Jarrett. If this is your first time on the channel and you're interested in the hobby of painting miniatures, start now by subscribing and clicking the bell notification so you don't miss any of these videos. So I like to start with a little sort of a amuse-bouche and a context setter for why I'm painting something a certain way. With Beastgrave, I wasn't super excited about that release or the miniatures at first, and even a poll I did on my community tab kind of suggested that viewers were feeling similarly. But now that I got my hands on the set, I've decided I really like the miniatures, both the Beastmen and the Kurnothi. I forget what they're called, the ones that look like deer. And the thing that changed my mind is someone on the Warhammer Underworld's Facebook group posted this idea of painting the Beastmen like the Fallen from Diablo, which is like a kind of a reddish orange skin. And right away I was like, that is a very cool idea, and I think that will make these models look awesome. So I was inspired by that and immediately went and bought the set and painted them that way. So this was not my idea, but I was really kind of interested in seeing how I could pull that off, and it was a bit of a challenge in a way. Now, when I paint a unit like this, or like a warband, and especially if they have a lot of different surfaces, like these guys have metal, they have cloth, they have fur, they have stone, that means there's going to be a lot of steps because I'm bouncing around between colors pretty quickly and frequently to achieve the right look on each of these textures, etc. So a bit of a longer video, a bit more cuts and edits, but hopefully you'll find this interesting and you'll dig the end result. Let's get right to it.
Here's a quick look at the miniatures we're going to be painting today. We've got the Beastmen done in the Diablo Fallen style. After priming all the miniatures with Vallejo Premium White Primer, I'm diving right in on the flesh, and I'm going to start with Gryph-hound Orange contrast paint. You can see how I'm applying it. I'm being fairly generous this time. Sometimes I use it as a light glaze, but in this case we're doing the contrast thing the way GW wants us to, in the sense of trying to create that little bit of extra shading happening from the pooling. But again, watch for any excess pooling and make sure you wick that up, because we don't want a blotchy finish on the flesh. The other thing is, this is my intended brightest tone of the flesh, because looking at the reference photo, it's a fairly dark orange trending towards almost red. And so I didn't want to take this all the way up to like almost a yellowy orange. Well, I guess it kind of is yellowy orange, but you know what I mean. Like, this is as bright as I want it to be, which means that rather than highlighting this when it's dry, we're going to end up shading down from here. So yeah, really the key here is just to make sure all of the flesh areas are covered and don't miss any, at the same time trying to avoid getting the orange anywhere it's not supposed to be. That can always be cleaned up with a little bit of Gray Seer or Corax White, for example, so that's not a big deal. But yeah, just trying to keep it neat and go through the whole warband and apply it to all the flesh as I'm doing here. Now, once that first step was completely dry, I go back with the same color, the Gryph-hound Orange, and I'm applying it again in a lot of the sort of shaded areas, so like under the arms, under the pecs, under the, in the neck area, anywhere that's covered, and that's going to have the effect of actually darkening the skin tone a bit further. A lot of the areas surrounding the Fallen's bright orangey flesh are dark in terms of armor, in terms of fur. So I want it to create a lot of contrast, and I want this flesh to really pop, because it really is the defining feature of these miniatures. So for the fur, I'm just going with Cygor Brown, and right out of the bottle I'm just applying it to all the furry patches. I'm trying to maybe slightly feather it out into the areas around it where appropriate, but mostly I'm just sticking to the sculpt of the fur. And you'll find in some spots it's like, on the chest and areas like that, so you want to check each model, and also along the tops of the hoofs. Quick step here, flesh tears red in any of the open mouths. This next step gives a pretty subtle result. It's probably pretty optional. I'm using Burnt Umber ink from Dale Rowney. I haven't used this FW ink before. The ones I had were Liquitex, and it's a little tricky to see how I'm doing it with I'm doing it with the airbrush, and I'm spraying upward on the model, mostly in the flesh areas, and to further darken the shadows, further darken those recessed areas, spraying along like the underside of their bent legs and things like that, just creating deeper shadows. But it is a fairly translucent, so the effect is subtle, and I think a person could live without it if they didn't have an airbrush. I'm going to do most of the horns fairly dark. I'm using sepia ink, Vallejo game ink, right out of the bottle, and I'm just running it all over the horns. You can see it works really well to color them and pull out that texture. And I'm doing that on all the horns, and they're going to end up quite dark on the actual living creatures, and then maybe a little bit less dark on the skulls. For any wooden areas, I'm using wildwood. This includes both the sort of tree branch type stuff on the bases, and then any of the handles. A lot of their weapons, like the spears and some of the daggers and things, have wooden handles, so I just use wildwood on all of them. You can use a different brown if you want to distinguish them. Now I'm using brown Vallejo game ink, and I'm just continuing to build the shadows. Like I said, the brightest part of the flesh is the Gryph-hound orange, so now I'm creating more depth and shading. And this doesn't require airbrush, which is nice. You can airbrush this ink very nicely, but you can also, as you see here, just do some nice translucent shading underneath all the surfaces, and things like between fingers as well. I also tried to use it to transition to the Cygor brown by the hoofs, but I don't think it worked, to be honest. Now some Black Templar contrast paint. I mentioned that I'm trying to keep things fairly dark in terms of armor, in terms of fur, and in terms of cloth and clothing. So I use this on a lot of the wraps, any sort of wrist wraps and things like that. Then what I did is I took snakebite leather and used it on all the pouches. There's a few pouches around. This isn't super dark, but I thought it would work. Now I'm going to use Blood Angel's red contrast paint. This is another fairly subtle shading step. So I'm going down right to reds and dark browns in the shadows of each of these guys. Here you can see I'm running it up against the underside of the various muscles, just to create more of a reddish orange and not just orange by itself. To start the process of darkening the tips of the horns, I'm using Vallejo Gaming Brown through my airbrush, and I'm just spraying it across like sort of the top third of everybody's horns, trying to just avoid spraying it towards anything I've already painted, which is actually a little bit easier than you think. Just got to work the angles. This guy as well, even though he's got metal tips on his horns. You could do this with a brush. I think it's just a little harder to get a nice subtle gradient, but you could do it. You may want to thin the ink down with water and do a couple more passes with it. Then I'm taking Vallejo black ink and doing the same thing, just leaving a little bit of the brown showing, so you get that transition into very dark horns. And I'm not doing that on the skull horns, just on the horns of the actual leaders. I thought a little bit of turquoise would be good as a color to offset the orange flesh, and so I'm using Pterodon turquoise, but I'm mixing that 50-50 with Black Templar in this case, because I'm going to be working on a lot of the cloth, like tabards and loincloths, and basically the entire cloth getup of this shaman guy and his headpiece. So at first it looked a little light, but I think I was just applying it too thinly, and so once I started to be a little more generous, it darkened down a bit, because again, I want this cloth to be darker, and I want it to allow that flesh to really stand out and create a lot of contrast. I am eventually going to come back and use that turquoise on its own for some additional spot color. These easy to build models actually create a bit more paint work because they always come with these sculpted bases, although they do look cool. I'm just using Black Templar, running it over all of the rocks on all of the bases. It was a little bit tricky to film due to the angle. I tried Corvus Black. I've heard that it's a really good paint. Just doing the straps on some of these guys, mostly this guy and his main getup. I don't know, I had trouble with this color. It wasn't going on right. I think either I didn't thin it enough or I thinned it too much, and the coverage wasn't as good as I was hoping, and I don't know. I think I just need to try it again, and I need to work on thinning it properly. So in this case, I did give up on it and switch to a different color. And that color is P3 Coal Black, which I actually really like. I think it's a very good color. And I'm using that on a lot of the straps, like things holding on quivers and belts and whatnot. I think I painted exactly one satchel with Gore-Grunta fur, so I would say this is very safely an optional step, and you could use any brown you like. Then I took Rhinox hide on some of the actual belts, so the waist belts. You could have used Coal Black on this, and that would be just fine, but I went for Rhinox hide. I was continuing with the dark theme and wanted to just mix up my colors a little bit on these guys. So yeah, I mentioned wildwood earlier for a lot of the wood. That includes the bows, so just including this clip here so you understand that that's how I did the bows. I mentioned this earlier, but I'm using Pterodon Turquoise contrast paint just as a bit of a spot color. I think it looks really nice juxtaposed against the orange flesh. It's kind of a bluish green, and I just used that on a lot of the different weapon wraps and weapon handles. In my quest for suitable dark colors, I decided to mix Snakebite Leather with Black Templar. Really like how this color turns out. It's like an olive sort of leather color, but definitely muted, definitely suitable for, like, I actually think it works well against the orange flesh. I like these sculpted bases, but I don't have a ton of patience for painting them, and I don't want to spend as much time on them. However, because there's a lot of textures and detail, they're easy to paint quickly with inks and contrast paints. So I went through and did all the vegetation and leaves and whatnot with Vallejo Game Ink Green right out of the bottle. And while that's drying, I took brown ink and went over the, fletches of the arrows and basically the arrow shafts as well. I guess I really like Athonian Camel Shade because I have a big 2-ounce bottle of it. I'm going to just do a loose mix of that with a bit of Vallejo Game Ink Black Green. And first I only put a couple drops in. You can see what I'm trying to do is stain both the leaves, which were a little too green, and also all that ground texture, like green foresty floor. That wasn't quite opaque enough, so I do go back and add a couple more drops of that black green. And eventually I also threw in a little bit of brown. I think that's coming up here. But once I had added the brown, that starts to be opaque enough to tint the bottom and not have to sort of paint the whole thing and then wash it. And so, yeah. And then I took Seraphim Sepia. I did that on the bowstrings. So yeah, here's me adding the brown ink. A little bit repetitive, but the reason being that initial wash just was leaving a little too light green, not quite doing the right trick on the base. But once I added this brown, it created this brownish green, kind of enhanced the look of Athonian Camel Shade, and it worked out great. It was nice and quick and easy to do. I don't know this guy's name, but he's really the only guy that has significant amount of metal armor on him. So I took Vallejo metal paint steel. I'm going again for fairly dark armor. The intention is going to be to use this as the base coat, and it really does cover great, even over the white primer. Use that as a base color and work that up to a brighter silver later. Stone was done, so any of the stone weapons, for example, that was done with Basilicanum Gray. I just washed it over. It pulls out the texture of the little notches very nicely. Now we use Skeleton Horde on all of the skulls and bony bits. They're all over the place. These guys like wearing bone trinkets, and of course there's the big one on the staff here, and all the bones and skeletons all over the bases. So every single thing gets a wash with Skeleton Horde, which is an awesome contrast paint. I really like it. Next I took Nuln Oil and washed it over a lot of the straps, especially the turquoise straps on the weapons and staffs, just to bring back a little definition between each of the strands of the wraps. Some of you know my feelings on severed heads, but I took, this one wasn't too bad. I took Gilliman Flesh and just did it very lightly. It's almost like a glaze on this one. Then for the hair, I used Vallejo Game Ink Skin Wash, which ironically seems too orange for skin, but does a great job of this reddish hair. Here's the warband so far. A lot of the main areas are done or blocked in, and now there's just a lot of little details left to do. For example, painting the tongues with Screamer Pink. Straps that were done with coal black previously are now highlighted with a bit of blue, slightly thinned. I felt like these guys shouldn't have beautiful teeth and bright teeth, but they obviously, you need to still have them showing, so I went with a Karak stone to have a slightly more muted color to the teeth and still have them show up. Some of the knickknacks and trinkets hanging off these guys are held on with little ropes and strings. I went through and painted those with Doombull Brown. For any scarring that was on these guys, I went through with Fire Dragon Bright and just dabbed it onto the scar tissue, which was fairly ripply and stood out. For the guy cutting his chest, I just ran Blood for the Blood God along the cut and onto some of the dribbles that are coming down. And I also use it on the blood that's dripping off the knife of one of the leaders. That's going to need 2 coats because it was kind of not covering the white completely, and that's fine. So just wait for it to dry and just come over it with a second coat. It looks nice and red and gooey. To darken the horns on the Ungors, I think they're called, I just took a little Vallejo black game ink and just painted over the tips of the horns, trying to leave a little bit showing. Needed to further darken the arrow shafts a bit, so I just used sepia and went over with a second coat, sepia ink from Vallejo. So I said that Gryph-hound Orange was going to be the brightest part of the flesh, but after doing the scars with the Fire Dragon Bright, I kind of liked how it looked, and so I decided to use just a little bit on some of the really high points like tips of ears, the ends of elbows and knees, things like that. Not doing an actual heavy highlight on all the areas, but just pulling out some of the sharpest points. Now the eyes on the Fallen are bright red, I believe, and they kind of glow. So to make them stand out against this orange flesh, I decided to start with a dot of white, which I would then color with something to give the eyes as much of a chance as possible to glow. And sorry, you can't see what I'm doing here, but I'm dotting tiny eyes as carefully as I can with white. To make that severed head look more dead, I took Drukchi Violet shade and just gave it a very thin glaze. Now I'm taking Dryad Bark and Baneblade Brown to do the hooves. First I start with a base of just Dryad Bark by itself, and it's kind of hard to get at these hooves, so just do your best. That's all I can say. And then I took Baneblade Brown and kind of holding the miniature upside down, I drew little lines as best I could to try and make the horns have texture. So to tint the white eyeballs red and have them look glowy, I first started by giving them a coat of Blood Angel's red contrast paint. I didn't thin that at all. I just used it out of the pot. It wasn't quite looking, you couldn't really see them enough. So I took a dot of Flash Gits Yellow, a very bright yellow, and just did a very small dot. And I think that makes a really nice glowing eye effect. I started out highlighting the bones and skulls with Ushabti bone, taking a small rough dry brush and just, like for skulls in particular, the big round part of their head are easier to do with like almost a round motion, but then that wasn't creating enough sort of contrast and definition and pop, so I switched to Screaming Skull and highlighted the bones with that. Now for the metal armor, I want it to stay fairly dark, so I took Chainmail. It's like a mid-range silver, more like a Runefang steel perhaps, and I just did a little bit of edging, a little bit of highlighting, but not covering large chunks of the surface because I wanted to keep that dark steel coming through. And you can see how I run it along the edge of the axe to give that a little sharpness. And then a little bit of edge highlighting on the arrow, like kill this way, and some of the edging on around the sort of body of the axe. Well, little guys have belly plates or whatever, so any other metal or armor you find need to be highlighted as well. And I did that sort of just on the upper half of the rounded area. Now I mixed black with sepia. I think it was 1 drop of black to 2 or 3 drops of sepia, just to make kind of a dark brownish color. And it's going to flow nicely because it's an ink, and just using it to create a little bit of separation between some of the areas you know, between the skull and the cloth or the underside of bags, things like that. It's really subjective where you put it, and just creating a little bit more dramatic shading, a little bit more dark lining around each of the models. And finally, some matte varnish through the airbrush finishes it off, and here's the finished unit. I'm actually really happy with how these look. I love the orangey red skin. I think it comes through looking a lot like those Fallen that we modeled them on from Diablo. And I think that turquoise spot color is working really well against the flesh as well. So hopefully you dig the results as much as I do. Couple ways to support the channel. Support the video by liking and sharing. Consider subscribing, and there's a tip jar link below for PayPal. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm likely going to do more Beastgrave warbands and terrain and whatnot in future videos, so subscribe to see those. We'll see you next time.